So after the Packers-Cardinals game, I saw a lot of comparisons for Aaron Rodgers, and the first one was obviously like a disciple to God because he threw up 2 Hail Marys and completed 2 of them in the season. And that's crazy. But that's not the one that I want to talk about. I saw another one, and that was the Aaron Rodgers compares to Peyton Manning. I thought this was a really interesting one because I'm going to go back just a little bit here. When he got drafted, he was a basically prodigy to Brett Favre, and obviously he had all the tools and stuff. So he was kind of a Steve Young to Joe Montana kind of comparison, which I thought that was a good comparison too. But I think my comparison when he was drafted would have been closer to Tom Brady behind Bledsoe, but no one really knew Bledsoe. I mean, this is looking after the fact of that one. I mean, no one knew Tom Brady was going to be good. No one knew Bledsoe was going to get hurt. All that was kind of like just kind of happenstance. And obviously, like you can't really, there's no way you could have said, oh, Tom Brady, 6th-round pick from Michigan, is going to be the face of the NFL in how many ever years it took him to be the face of the NFL. He's going to win 6 titles. You can't predict that. But with Rodgers being that number 1 pick, it does compare more favorably to the Steve Young and Joe Montana comparison. Being the young guy, really athletic, really good, coming out of college, higher up pick behind the legend, which Steve Young was the young guy, and then Joe Montana was the legend. So with Brett Favre being the legend, and Aaron Rodgers being the young kid coming up out of school, so I think that's a good comparison for the draft and like how he got to his team. But currently, when I'm thinking about this, when I think of who does Aaron Rodgers compare most favorably to, is actually, ironically, Peyton Manning. Now, before you get all like how does that even work, let me just drop some knowledge here. Peyton Manning, yes, he is a 9-1 and done, and Rodgers doesn't really do that in the playoffs, I should say. Peyton Manning has 9 and dones. Could have been 10 this year, but he doesn't. He's going to end up with 9. And then you got Aaron Rodgers, who usually gets to like the 2nd or 3rd round. He doesn't really go out in the 1st round. But that's just a stat. If you look at I'm going to talk about the playoffs first since I started out with a 1 and done conversation. Manning, 1 ring in the first couple of years of him being a starter. Rodgers, 1 ring in the first couple of years of him being a starter. Coincidence? Maybe. But I still think that's kind of a reasonable comparison to go from, or to compare both of those guys. And I mean, it's good because they both got a ring, which is what you can compare it to, or what you can compare. It's because they both have 1 ring. They've both had and then another thing with that is they haven't really had a lot of playoff success. Peyton Manning obviously has been to 3 Super Bowls, and Rodgers I think has only been to 2, maybe 1. I'd have to look it up, but I know he's been to at least 1 because he has the ring. So that's something to think about there. Going away a little bit from the Super Bowl thing is if you think about them in the playoffs, usually, I'm going to go back to Manning as a Colt. He usually was one of the better guys in the league, stats-wise, and he always led his team to a great record, no matter who he had around him. Yes, he did have Marvin Harrison and can't think of the other, Reggie Wayne. But if you really think about it, you've got Aaron Rodgers, who has Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb. Nelson compares more to Reggie Wayne of being a possession receiver, which he can be explosive at times. And if you think about Randall Cobb, he compares more to Marvin Harrison, who's a big-bodied receiver, catches the ball, and can run a little bit. Obviously, that's not a direct comparison because wide receivers have changed in the more recent years to favor more of the bigger, faster guys. And it can't be a direct comparison, but it kind of works in this sense. And then if you think about the Rodgers just a little bit too, he has never really had a great offensive line to work around. He's always had to be nimble in the pocket and all, being a little bit more mobile, and that's kind of where he separates himself from Manning, is he's got a little bit more mobility than Peyton does. But when you think about it, Rodgers never really had a line. Manning never really had a line either. So that's more of a team comparison, but still works. And then obviously you can't really affect how that changes down the road. I can't predict it. I can't predict how Aaron Rodgers will fare in this, but Manning was a lifetime Colt until he had the neck surgeries, and obviously that was I don't expect that to happen to Aaron Rodgers, but it can. And then after Manning had those surgeries, he became a Bronco, so stayed in the conference but went to a different division. With Rodgers, you can't really predict that. I do expect him to be a lifetime Packer, but he could follow suit in the Brett Favre mold, where he goes, maybe not necessarily to the Vikings, but someone with a bad quarterback situation, I guess is the best way to say that. So that's obviously way down the road. I can't predict that. I'm not going to talk about that one. But if that happens, that's even more way to compare Rodgers and Manning. And then the last thing on the playoffs here is like I said, they've been to one playoff each. Well, not one playoff. They've won one Super Bowl each. Sorry, Manning's been to a couple more, but he was a couple more later. Like Rodgers is almost at that time in his career where Manning went to his second Super Bowl and third Super Bowl. And Rodgers still has a couple more years. He's only in his like 8th year or something like that. So he's got a couple years of wiggle room there, but if he keeps following this path, he's going to be more like Manning than not. And more of where this comes, like, I guess, to where you see it a little bit more is in the regular season. If you think about it, and I was thinking about it the other day when I was thinking about this topic, you have Peyton Manning, who was I would say arguably the best regular season quarterback in NFL history, and when he was with the Colts, he was throwing probably like 4,500 yards a year and just absurd numbers for the time. This is when the running back was still a running back and not really a receiving threat, more of just a runner, I guess, kind of like a threat, a dual threat, and a big part of the offense. It wasn't really a passing league yet. And if you look at Aaron Rodgers, he always has those stats too. Yes, they're a little bit more, but that's because of the way that the league has shifted a little bit. So if you think about it, Rodgers is really Peyton Manning copied. He's throwing for almost 5,000 yards a year. He's throwing for a bunch of yards. He's throwing for everything else, and then you got Manning who did that when he was with the Colts. Obviously, Manning hasn't aged right. Yeah, he looked good at the beginning of last year and obviously 2 years ago when he went to the Super Bowl with the Broncos. But still, you still have if you look at the regular season and a little bit of the younger careers of Manning and Rodgers, well, if you look up Manning's career up to the amount of years that Rodgers has been in the league, they're mostly similar just because of if you think about it, like I said with the stats, this is the best way I'm going to put this for the regular season stats. Manning was near the top of the pack every year in passing yards and touchdowns. Rodgers has been the same. So, Manning always had Tom Brady to compete against, and I don't really know who Rodgers' comparison would be in that. He'd have to be a couple years younger than him, so 2008 or 2009 draft. I don't know. I'd have to. I think the more for that comparison would be Cam Newton and Russell Wilson. I'll talk about that in a different topic, but I think Rodgers is just following along with the Peyton Manning mold really well, and I think he might not intentionally be doing it, but it is happening. So I guess we'll just see what happens there. And I still think Rodgers is, if we see him win not win a Super Bowl, but go to 2 more Super Bowls in the future and still put up the amount of yardage he has. So, like, say in the next 5 years, let's say he goes to 2 Super Bowls and doesn't win them, he's going to be right on track with Peyton Manning. Yeah, obviously a first ballot Hall of Famer, but they're going to be right on the same track, and that the narrative of Rodgers as a copy of Manning is going to just keep growing and growing and growing, and I think that's particularly viable based on what I've laid out here today. So, if you guys have any thoughts on that, please leave them in the comments. Yes, I will probably see a bunch of, if I do see comments, it'll be, well, Aaron Rodgers is a lot better because he's mobile and all this stuff, and I agree with you. But stats-wise, they have about the same career with Rodgers and Manning. I'm not saying skill set-wise, just stats-wise. So, that's my opinion.